Bibliophiles of the internet, we are officially somehow in the second half of the year, which means it's about time I shared my second quarter reading stats. We're going to talk about all the things: how many books I read, how many pages I read, most read genres, reading format, most read publishers, library savings, etc. But before we dive into that, I have been waiting 3 long months to atone for my sins, because in my first quarter stats video, I forgot to share the most popular cover colors of the quarter. And call me old-fashioned, but I believe the people deserve to know. So let me formally make amends and say that for the first quarter of 2025, the top 3 cover colors were purple at 4 books, red at 7 books, and blue coming in at a whopping 13 books. Now that my conscience is finally clear, we can move on to the second quarter of 2025. Starting with the big picture number, the total number of books I read, in the second quarter I read 41 books. To put that in context, in total, by the end of July, I had completed 80 books so far in 2025. At that same exact time last year, I had read 50 books, so I am 30 entire books ahead of my 2024 reading pace. And looking at 2025, 51% of the books I read for the entire year were books that I just read in the second quarter. Truly wild stuff. Let's break down that number further by looking at what I read for each month in the quarter, starting with April, when I read 10 books. Those were Where the Axe is Buried, The Perils of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Of Monsters and Mainframes, The Influencers, The Potency of Ungovernable Impulses, The Tainted Cup, Conclave, Against Techno-Ableism, Hunchback, and The West Passage. In May, I read 14 books. Those were Kiss Me Maybe, Up in Smoke, Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame, A Sharp Endless Need, I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself, The Duke Steals Hearts and Other Body Parts, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, Bochica, Lost Ark Dreaming, Salvacion, Twelfth Night, Venom and Vow, The Devils, and The Love Club. And finally, in June, I read an absolutely unruly 17 books. Those were Dan in Green Gables, Alligator Tears, Flight of the Fallen, Cosmic Love at the Multiverse Hair Salon, Camp, The No Girlfriend Rule, And They Were Roommates, We Can Never Leave, So Many Stars, The Lilac People, The Darkness Outside Us, Immaculate Conception, I Am the Dark That Answers When You Call, Sex Is As Sex Does, ASL, Puzzle Heart, and Volatile Memory. That means what I read in April accounted for roughly 24% of my reading for the quarter, what I read in May accounted for 34%, and what I read in June made up about 41%, which is dangerously close to half. Moving right along, let's take a look at the total number of pages I read in the second quarter. In total, I read 12,961 pages. And I think this is really interesting because even though I read 15 more books compared to last quarter, that's only a difference of about 600 pages. Which kind of makes sense because I think I read a few more chunky books in the first quarter compared to the second quarter, so that tracks. If we go even further, that gives us an average of about 316 pages per book. Alright, now let's dive into my most read genres for the quarter, and even though I usually keep this to the top 3, this time I think we're going to look at the top 5. Going in ascending order, my 5th most read genre for the quarter was historical fiction, coming in at 4 books. Then we have nonfiction coming in at 5 books, fantasy comes in 3rd with 7 books, sci-fi takes 2nd place with 8 books, and surprisingly, contemporary comes in at the top at 9 books. Like I say every quarter, this is more of a vibe than a science, and also because I read very widely, it's not unprecedented for genres to drop in and off this chart from quarter to quarter. I think it is interesting to note, though, that I read more nonfiction books this quarter compared to last quarter, and in addition to nonfiction, historical fiction, sci-fi, and contemporary carried over as some of my most consistently read genres for the year so far. So some interesting movement and consistencies. Next is a category that I like to lovingly call How Many Were Queer, in which I take stock of how many books I read this past quarter were queer books. As a queer myself, this is a question that always tickles my queer little brain, and this quarter, I assume in large part thanks to Pride Month, in which I exclusively read queer books, overall I read 29 queer books. That's up 7 queer books from last quarter, and that also means that queer books made up about 70% of my overall reading for the second quarter, which is an 11% increase compared to the first quarter. Again, Pride Month doing a lot of the heavy lifting there, but of course I read queer all year, so we'll have to see how that number holds up going forward. Up next, let's talk about reading format. As always, going from least read format to most read format. My least read format for this quarter is unsurprisingly once again mixture/hybrid reads, which indicates books that were completed by accessing more than one format, so audiobook and physical book, ebook and audiobook, etc. I only did 2 hybrid reads this past quarter. Where the Axe is Buried I started as a physical book, but I think finished as an audiobook, and Twelfth Night I started as a physical book and switched over to the ebook to finish. Next we actually have ebooks, and for the second quarter I read 5 books as ebooks. Then we have physical books. This past quarter I read 8 books as physical books. And surprising no one, the format that absolutely dominated dominated the second quarter was once again audiobooks. I read 26 books as audiobooks. So again, if we compare that to the first quarter of 2025, ebooks went up, physical books went down, and audiobooks went up, all of which absolutely tracks. And speaking of audiobooks being my most popular format, I thought it would be interesting to start tracking how many hours I listen to audiobooks every quarter. And for the second quarter of 2025, I spent about 259 hours listening to audiobooks. Let's move on over to audience spread, which is basically a look at the age demographics I read from in the second quarter. There are many age demographics, of course, but personally I tend to keep to middle grade, young adult, and adult. Going again from least read to most read, my least read demographic this quarter was unfortunately middle grade books. In the second quarter, I only read one lonely middle grade book. That's a huge dip from the first quarter where I read 7 middle grade books. But on the bright side, in total, that's still more middle grade books overall than I read for the entirety of 2024. My second most read demographic was young adult books. This past quarter, I read 13 young adult books. On the flip side of middle grade books going down, this is a huge upward surge for YA because in the first quarter of 2025, I only read 3 YA books. So that's a major difference. Even though I know YA isn't my go-to demographic anymore, I still really enjoy it, and more importantly, I still really believe in it. I'm not one of those people who's given up on YA entirely or who is ready to write off all YA as bad or insipid or lesser. I think there's so much value in YA and so many exciting things still happening in that space. So I want to make sure I'm still tapping in from time to time. Which means my most read demographic for the quarter, as it consistently has been, is adult books. This quarter I read 27 adult books, which makes up roughly 66% of my entire reading for the second quarter. Now we're going to talk about long and short books, starting with the longest book I read this quarter according to page count. And unsurprisingly, that was The Devils by Joe Abercrombie, which clocked in at 560 pages. On the flip side, the shortest book I read this quarter according to page count was Hunchback by Saoi Ichigawa, which was a mere 112 pages. The longest audiobook of the quarter is not going to be a surprise because it's also The Devils by Joe Abercrombie, which had a runtime of 25 hours and 5 minutes. My shortest audiobook of the quarter is also not going to be a surprise because it's once again Hunchback, which was just shy of 2 hours at 1 hour and 59 minutes. Unlike last quarter, we actually have something to talk about in regards to my most read authors of the quarter. I had 2 authors I read from the most who tied at 2 books apiece. I read 2 books from A.M. McLemore this past quarter, and I also read 2 books from Marissa Crane, who I think is easily my favorite new-to-me author so far in 2025. Speaking of new-to-me authors, I also like to keep track of how many new authors I'm reading from because I think it's important to seek out and support new voices. In total, for the second quarter, I read 24 authors who were new to me in some way, shape, or form. To get more specific, 9 authors I read from were debut authors and 15 authors were new to me, meaning they've been previously published before, but I was reading their work for the first time. I also like to look at how many repeat authors I'm reading from, by which I mean how many authors I'm returning to and continuing to read from. And this quarter, I came back to 16 repeat authors. And for anyone wondering why 24 new to me authors and 16 repeat authors doesn't add up to my quarterly total of 41 books, it's because there's a slight discrepancy with Marissa Crane, who was both a new to me author when I read A Sharp Endless Need, and then a repeat author when I read I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself. So I just didn't count them twice. Very quickly, I will say my average star rating for the quarter was 4.02 stars. That's actually down about 3/10, which makes sense because I had some 2-star and 3-star books this past quarter, but that wasn't able to totally tank my overall star rating because I also had some very high 4 stars and even a few 5 stars. Speaking of, another new stat I thought I would introduce is looking at my 5-star reads for the quarter. This is just for fun. Plenty of my favorite books every single year are technically not 5-star books for me, but I'm still curious. This quarter, I actually only had 2 5-star reads, both of which I read in June. Coincidentally, they're both nonfiction books, and those were Alligator Tears and Sex Is As Sex Does. And just for posterity, since I didn't share this stat last quarter, that's way down compared to the first quarter, where 10 of the 37 books I read were books that I rated 5 stars. To put that in perspective, that means nearly a third of the books I read in the first quarter were 5-star books, and comparatively, only 1/20th of the books I read in the second quarter were 5-star books. Again, it's important to recognize that that doesn't tell the whole story because there are plenty of books I rated 4, 4.5, and even 4.75 stars in the second quarter that will undoubtedly make an appearance on my list of favorite books of 2025. We're going to keep it moving by looking at my most read publishers for the quarter. This will not account for every single book I read this quarter because I'm just looking at the top 3. Ranking in third place, surprisingly, is independent and small presses. I read 6 books from indie and small presses. These are any publishers or imprints that exist independently from the big 5 publishers. Small presses, boutique presses, and academic presses all count towards this category. Coming in second place is Penguin Random House. I read 11 books published under Penguin Random House imprints. And absolutely dominating the charts for the second quarter of 2025 is Macmillan. I read a whopping 16 books published by Macmillan imprints. Next, and I will not forget this time, we are talking about the most popular cover colors for the second quarter of 2025. The third most popular cover color was actually black. I read 6 books with covers that were predominantly black. We actually have a tie for second place, starting with purple. I read 7 purple books, and that tied with the color pink. I also read 7 pink books. And the most popular cover color for the second quarter in a row was once again blue. I read 12 blue books. Next, let's look at series versus standalones. We'll start with an overview of the series I read from in the second quarter. Overall, I read 8 books that were part of series. 4 books were series openers and 2 books were series finales. For posterity and accountability, I will point out that of the 3 new series I started in the first quarter, none of them were continued, at least yet. So if I read 8 books in series, that means the other 33 books I read this past quarter were standalones. And as I always say, I think it's obvious that I have a preference. I also try to strike some kind of balance between reading new releases and backlist books, so that's also something that I track. And in the second quarter, 24 books I read were new releases either published or set to be published in 2025, and the other 17 books I read were backlist books. The most backlist book I read in the second quarter was Conclave by Robert Harris, which did have a little bit of a resurgence late last year coinciding with the movie adaptation, but it was actually originally published back in 2016. I also do keep track of where the books I read are set, so let's go over the most popular settings in descending order. Again, because I primarily read English language books that are traditionally published, the majority of the books I read this past quarter, in fact 20 of them, are set in the United States. 9 books I read were not set on Earth, meaning they either took place in a completely separate fantasy world or they were set in space. 2 books I read were set in the United Kingdom, and then we have a bunch of locations with only 1 book. I read 1 book set in Italy, 1 book set in Europe, 1 book set in Japan, 1 book set in Germany, 1 book set in France, 1 book set in Colombia, 1 book set in Lagos, and 1 book set in Alta California, which yes, is a unique setting contextualized by a very specific time period, place, and politic. And I wasn't able to log a specific location for where the axe is buried, which takes place in multiple locations across the world. Penultimately, let's talk about how much money I saved by using my local library this past quarter. So overall, I saved a total of $179.19. That's almost $50 more than what I saved in the first quarter, which I will happily take. Overall, I checked out 8 books total across different formats, 4 physical books, 3 audiobooks, and 1 ebook. And even though I did have to return one of those books unread, it still counts towards my savings because I still saved myself money by checking it out. And lastly, as always, we're going to close by talking about my top 5 favorite books I read for the quarter. Going in chronological order, we're going to start with A Sharp Endless Need by Marissa Crane. It was really hard for me to choose between the 2 Marissa Crane books I read this quarter because I think they were both brilliant. But I think this one stood out to me just a smidge more, maybe because Danny Martinet gave such a powerful and earnest performance in the audiobook. But this is a raw, intimate, coming-of-age story about Mac, who is a high school senior and star of the high school basketball team. And her life dramatically changes when her father very suddenly passes away, and then shortly after that, a new transfer student named Liv comes to play on Mac's team. The 2 of them realize they have this electrifying, game-winning chemistry that translates into something incredibly dynamic both on and off the court. This is one of those books that completely bowled me over, not just in the first few pages, but in the opening passages, in the opening sentences. I said this about both of Mac Crane's books in my author taste test vlog, but their writing is pretty much as close to living, breathing poetry as prose can possibly get. There is so much emotional clarity packed into what they do, as evidenced in this book that has a very simple, quiet premise, and yet is overflowing with intense character dynamics and a level of introspection that is so quiet but so powerful at the same time. Both of Matt Crane's books are a work of genius in my humble opinion, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. My next favorite book of the quarter has to be Lost Ark Dreaming by Suyi Davies Okumbawa. This is an absolutely jam-packed novella that blends sci-fi and dystopia. It's set in a future version of West Africa where the rising tides have literally made it impossible to inhabit the land. So there are these huge towers built up to the sky, and the wealthier you are, the higher up away from the water you get to live. And again, because the tides are already rising, the lower classes are living on floors that are submerged underwater. And one day, 3 of the tower's employees, who all belong to different classes, are forced to work together when they're alerted of a potential breach in the tower's lower floors. This is another absolutely phenomenal book. Not only are the stakes incredibly high in this action-packed, suspenseful, plot-driven story, but the commentary is second to none as the story forces these 3 characters to confront the fact that their allegiance to this literal power structure and the work they do to keep that structure running is never going to be their salvation. The underlying message of this story is about how we are all called not just to live for ourselves, but to be in service of those around us and to find pathways forward for all of us, not just some of us. This was just great, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. I also absolutely loved Alligator Tears by Edgar Gomez. Edgar is the queer Latina author of High Risk Homosexual. This is their second memoir, and they absolutely knocked it out of the park. I said as much in my June wrap-up, but every time I read Edgar's work, I'm reminded of how memoir is not simply the act of excavating and narrating memory, but rather organizing seemingly disparate life moments and finding the through line that connects everything and expands the boundaries of memory beyond just the personal experience. The challenge of memoir is making the personal feel both intimate and revelatory all at once, and also universal at the same time. And I have so much respect for what Edgar was able to accomplish and share in this incredibly smart and poignant and personable memoir. Penultimately, I have to show some love for Immaculate Conception by Ling Ling Huang. I do have to confess, this partially holds a very special place in my heart because I was able to host a read-along for it in June. That was the first time I've ever done anything like that, and talking through all the intricacies of this story with old friends and new friends made reading it a very special experience. But I would definitely call this weird fiction. It's a blend of speculative, sci-fi, and horror following a young artist named Enka who came to art later in life, and even though she's gotten a scholarship to a prestigious art school, she feels very insecure about her artistry compared to her peers. But she somehow becomes close friends with Matilda, one of the most popular girls at school, who everyone hails as an artistic genius. So of course, Enka is desperate to keep her close. Eventually, she hears about this new form of technology called scaffold that allows a person to fully occupy someone else's mind and to sift through someone's emotions, memories, and thoughts. And it occurs to Enka that this might just be the way to keep Matilda as close can get. This story is absolutely wild and unhinged, but what's so great is that it's a very quiet build to those moments of instability and obsession. The story begins in an unassuming way and very gradually pushes the reader and the characters towards the breaking point. And not only is this story so incredibly striking and unforgettable because of its strangeness and bizarre inhibition, but because it has so much to say about what art is, what it can be, what it should be, and how external forces like Western individualism and untested technology are warping those conceptions in real time. Art as we know it is currently under threat, and that is something the story is really grappling with in so many different ways. There are so many fascinating ideas and worthwhile conversations happening in this book. It broke open my mind in the best possible way, and I just loved it. Last but certainly not least is perhaps the most wild card pick of all these selections, because this book I picked up on a whim based off a very obscure Instagram post, but that is none other than Sex Is As Sex Does by Paisley Kira. I'm just going to be upfront and say that I am not going to do this book justice, but it's a nonfiction book written by a trans professor and researcher examining how different institutions and governing bodies within the US specifically have differing definitions and standards when it comes to how the state or government classifies a person's legal sex. So regardless of body composition, gender identity, genitalia, legal paperwork, court orders, etc., the same person can be classified as having a different sex marker according to different state actors because they have different standards. And this book looks at why that is that is, and ultimately it's working towards an understanding of how sex is defined by its function in society and what kinds of consequences that has not only for transgender populations but also other vulnerable populations. This is a very challenging read in more ways than one. Not only is the text itself very dense and full of legal jargon and academic theory, but it really and truly troubled the boundaries of my thinking when it comes to how we understand and define sex. It really made me reckon with the fact that regardless of how someone feels or presents, sex is ultimately defined by these different institutions based on the services those institutions aim to provide. And not just that, but it made me also think about how so many of those services are based on leveraging the interest of the state. As materially transphobic as these discrepancies can be, it made me realize that the issue is less to do with institutional transphobia and more to do with the policing, tracking, and surveilling of people and the distribution of resources, especially in ways that reinforce and further the colonial project. So I really appreciate the framework of this research and its intersectionality in exploring how this issue does not singularly or uniquely affect trans people and how ultimately we should be working towards dismantling this system, not just for the sake of queer and trans people, but for all marginalized populations that are threatened or even erased by these systemic classifications. This is another book that really gives you so much to think about and gives language to so many intersectional struggles in this country. So if you can give it your time, your attention, and your brain power, I think you will definitely be rewarded in the end. So there you have it. Those are all my reading stats and favorites for the second quarter of 2025. I really love putting these videos together, so I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting. If you would like to share any interesting stats or new favorite books of your own, I would love to hear all about it down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.